But I have to start by commenting on certain assumptions that you make in that question, because the idea of the hygiene hypothesis was first published 30 years ago. And in the last 10 years in particular, we have learned an awful lot more, and we know much more about what is really happening now. For instance, we no longer think that hygiene has so much to do with it, though food certainly does. You see, what we now understand is that when you are born, your immune system is rather like a computer, which has hardware and software, but no data. And it has to have data, and the information, comes from exposure to certain bacteria and other microorganisms. And so, of course, the real question is, which microorganisms does our immune system need to encounter, and where are they, and why in the modern world are we not meeting enough of these microorganisms? So I think I should address that issue first. Well, firstly, the first microorganisms that your immune system needs to encounter are the so-called microbiota, the organisms that live in your gut. And there are as many microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, archaea, many organisms in your gut as you have cells in your body. So, you have more bacterial cells than you have human cells. We are all ecosystems. We are not really individuals. And so the first thing that your immune system has to do is encounter the microbiota from your mother. And so the organisms from your mother are transmitted, some of them before you are born. Amazingly, some of these microorganisms are transferred into the baby while the baby is still unborn, still in the uterus. And then many more are transferred while the baby is being born, because obviously there are organisms coming from the anus and from the vagina and so on. And then, so that is an extremely important process. The problem is that in the modern world, much of this transfer of organisms from the mother's microbiota to the baby is interrupted. It can be interrupted by antibiotics. It can be interrupted by cesarean delivery, surgical delivery. And it can be interrupted by lack of breastfeeding, because in fact, amazingly, breast milk is not sterile. Breast milk actually also contains microorganisms which are needed by the baby. And breast milk also contains certain substances which you could call prebiotics. That's molecules which are not digested by the baby, but which can be digested by the organisms that you want the baby to have in its intestine. So these molecules are feeding the baby in the intestine, feeding the microorganisms in the intestine of the baby, and so encouraging those particular microorganisms. So all of these processes lead to the right microorganisms becoming established in the gut, and they provide signals which are essential for the development of the immune system. This is particularly true during the first weeks and months of life. And we know that because it partly from animal experiments and partly from epidemiological experiments in humans, where we look at when antibiotics were given and what the consequences are for the baby. We know, for instance, that antibiotics given during pregnancy or in the early months of the life of the baby increase the likelihood of that baby becoming fat, becoming obese in later life. And in fact, it's dose related. The more doses of antibiotic in pregnancy or in the first months of life, the more likely the baby is to become overweight. The same is true for allergic disorders. The more antibiotics during pregnancy or in the early months of life, the more likely the baby is to have allergic disorders. So it's these things which stop our exposure to the organisms that we pick up from our family, which are now thought to be really important, not so much cleaning products and so on in the home. But then then there's more than this, because after we have encountered and picked up the organisms from our mother, then there are the microorganisms from the natural environment. It's become more and more certain that we need to meet organisms from nature, from the green environment around us, because that provides, again, data for the computer, for data for the immune system, which is a sort of computer. It provides organisms. It even provides some genes, some DNA, genetic material. The amazing thing is, for instance, that Japanese people can digest peculiar polysaccharides in seaweed. You know what I mean by seaweed? And and it's not that the Japanese have in their genetics any genes that encode enzymes that can digest seaweed. It's that because they eat seaweed so often, the organisms in their gut have picked up the genes from sea organisms, from marine organisms. So that is an illustration of just how important the organisms in our gut really are, because they provide us with flexibility. They can learn, they can pick up ways of digesting new important molecules. And then another very exciting recent observation is that the environment contains spores. Now, spores are certain bacteria produce very small, very, very resistant forms which can persist in the environment for hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years. And it had been known for some time that these spore-forming organisms, which are numerous in the gut, are particularly involved in driving the formation of the parts of the immune system which regulate the immune system, or if you like, the police force of the immune system. Because the immune system is dangerous, it has to be controlled. It mustn't be allowed to do whatever it wants. So it turns out that if you look, for instance, at people with multiple sclerosis, which of course is an autoimmune disease where the immune system is doing something it should not, because the immune system is attacking the patient's own brain, it turns out that if you look at the spore-forming organisms from the guts, from the feces of patients with multiple sclerosis, those organisms fail to do what they should do, which is drive the formation of the lymphocytes that regulate the immune system. They fail to drive what are called regulatory T lymphocytes. Whereas if you take the spore-forming organisms from somebody who does not have multiple sclerosis, under the same conditions in a laboratory, these organisms will drive formation of the cells that regulate the immune system. So these spores, of course, we can pick up from the natural environment. We also know now that the airways, the tubes that take the air down into our lungs, also need exposure to microorganisms from the environment, because it seems that if you don't do that in the early months of life, then the balance between the attack mechanisms and the control mechanisms, the regulatory mechanisms, is not set up correctly. And so you are more likely to have allergic disorders and so forth. In fact, it's very interesting in the context of the natural environment that it has been found recently that there's a linear relationship between the number of cats and dogs in the home and a decrease in the likelihood of allergic disorders, any allergic disorder. So the more cats and dogs in the home, the less likely you are to have an allergic disorder. And we think that is because cats and dogs bring the natural environment into the home. So you see, what I'm trying to say is that there are many factors which are affecting whether or not we encounter the organisms that are necessary for setting up the immune system and setting up the metabolic system. And those mechanisms are things like antibiotics, cesarean sections, lack of breastfeeding, bad diet, which we will come to in a minute, because I know diet is of interest to you, and also lack of exposure to the natural environment. And we now think these are the important things, not so much domestic hygiene or cleaning. And in fact, that's a very good news because, of course, hygiene is a really good thing. Hygiene saves lives. You know, of all the things that the medical profession has produced to help human health, vaccines and hygiene are the two really important ones. So we don't need to abandon hygiene, especially hand washing, because that stops the transmission of infections. And it's not those infections which the immune system needs to encounter. It needs to encounter mother's microbiota and organisms from the natural environment. But then, of course, we come to the issue of diet, because we now, of course, if your diet is feeding not only you, it's also feeding the microorganisms in your gut. And so if you don't offer the right foods to the microorganisms in your gut, which breast milk tries to do by actually containing substances which feed the good organisms, but if we don't have the right diet, then we stop feeding the good organisms. In particular, the organisms that digest fiber. Now, fiber is a silly word. I mean, you know, in English it sort of means, you know, long, stringy things. But in fact, it really means at a molecular level just long, thin molecules, though they could be soluble. And it really just refers to plant cell walls, you know, the firm, solid walls of plant cells. And so if you don't eat enough fruit and vegetables, then you don't take in enough fiber. And if you don't have enough fiber in your diet, the organisms that are particularly important for driving the mechanisms that regulate the immune system start to get depleted. They start to die out. And in fact, the experiment has been done in mice where they actually gave the mice a diet without fiber. And eventually, over a few generations, the organisms that live on the fiber disappeared completely. There were none of them in the guts of these animals. And these animals could not regulate their immune system because they could not develop the police force of the immune system. And of course, all this makes so much sense now, because if we think about the diseases which are increasing in modern urban Western societies, they're all diseases that are caused by the failure to regulate the immune system. For instance, allergies are crazy. Why is your immune system attacking grass pollen? It surely has better things to do than make you ill attacking something harmless. And then, of course, autoimmune diseases, I've already mentioned multiple sclerosis, but also type 1 diabetes is another one. In type 1 diabetes, the immune system is destroying the cells that make insulin. So again, the immune system is attacking something it should not. Clearly, the immune system should not be attacking grass pollen, and it should not be attacking your brain, and it should not be attacking the cells that make your insulin. And then similarly, the increasing. Things like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And these are diseases which are at least partly caused by the immune system attacking the contents of the gut. And again, the inflammatory bowel diseases like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease are at least partly caused by the immune system attacking the contents of your gut, you know, the contents of your intestine. So attacking the microorganisms in your intestine. Whereas obviously the immune system is supposed to tolerate those organisms while attacking pathogenic organisms that cause disease, that can cause infections. So, and then so those three classes of disease I refer to as the forbidden target diseases, because the immune system is attacking things it should not attack. That's allergens, contents of the gut, and your own tissues. But then there are some other diseases that are increasing in the rich urban societies as well. Those are diseases where there is systemic inflammation that is not being turned off. So I should just explain that. It's quite easy to take a blood sample and measure the amount of background inflammation that is taking place in that individual over the last 24 hours, because there are molecules that indicate the past inflammation. And if you do that in developing countries, what you usually find is that the levels of these molecules that indicate inflammation are very, very low unless the individual has an infection. So when there is an infection, the inflammatory mechanisms turn on and then they turn off again when the infection disappears. But if we take somebody from, say, America, I don't know about your country, and you look at in their blood, you will often find that they have permanently raised levels of these markers of inflammation. Okay? And this is really bad news because if you have permanently raised levels of markers of inflammation, you are more likely to get metabolic disorders, you are more likely to get type 2 diabetes, you are more likely to have heart disease, you are more likely to get depression, literally, more likely to be depressed. And so it's incredibly important that the immune system turns off inflammation that is no longer required. And that is not happening in the Western world. So, how do we know that all of these things really are related to the gut microbiota? And the easiest way to prove that, in fact, is to do transfer of microorganisms from humans into rodents, mice or rats, which have been depleted of their microbiota. For instance, you can make germ-free mice, that's mice that have been born by caesarean section into a sterile environment. So those mice have no organisms in their guts. They're also very stupid. I mean, literally, their brains don't develop properly if they have no microbiota in their guts. They have very abnormal stress responses, and they very, very easily become allergic to things. So those are very, very sick animals. But the point is that if you take germ-free mice like the ones I have just described, and you put into them microbiota from a fat human, and into other germ-free mice, you put microbiota from a thin human, and then you put all of these mice on the same diet. The amazing thing is that the ones that received the microbiota from the fat human put on more weight than the animals that received the microbiota from the thin human. Now that shows you that the microorganisms in the gut are actually causing the different amount of weight to be put on in the presence of the same diet. And you can do the same thing, amazingly, with depression. If you take the microbiota from depressed people or the microbiota from happy people, and you transfer them into germ-free animals, the ones that receive the microbiota from the depressed person are unhappy mice. Amazing. You can test for this. It's not very difficult. They are frightened of everything and they hide in a corner and they don't socialize with other animals. They behave quite differently from animals that receive the microbiota from a happy human. So, all of this kind of thing. Oh, and you can do the same thing with allergic disorders. If you take microbiota from babies that are milk allergic, or microbiota from babies that have also been fed on cow's milk but are not allergic to the cow's milk, and you put these organisms from the allergic babies and the not allergic babies into mice that you have made allergic to cow's milk, the microbiota from the not allergic babies actually suppresses the allergic response in the mice, whereas the microbiota from the allergic babies encourages the allergic response in the mice. So all of this kind of work directly proves the crucial involvement of the microorganisms in our guts in regulating the immune system and also regulating the metabolic system. So sorry, I have talked for a long time. So, but, mm, mm, No, no, I don't think it does. I mean, when you were talking about these people who can dive underwater for a long time, that is an ability which will have developed over many generations. You know, the rate of evolution of a human being is terribly slow. So, you know, the ones who could dive for longest will have been the most successful and able to bring up more of the shellfish or whatever. So they will have been more successful fathers or mothers. I think maybe the women dive too. So they produce more children. So gradually that you evolve this ability. But that's not the way the immune system works. You see, the immune system had a very special problem. This is actually quite interesting because it was really when the vertebrates evolved about 500 million years ago that we started to have this extremely complicated microbiota. You know, the people call it the microbiome when they're talking about the DNA, or microbiota when we're talking about the organisms themselves. I should just explain. Okay, so this started to evolve about 500 million years ago. And so the immune system was given the job of farming and looking after the microbiota. I mean, if you remove the immune system, the microbiota goes crazy, you know, and the gut gets inflamed, and you know, and you get into a terrible mess. So the immune system is farming. It's the only word to use. It is farming the microbiota. But there are thousands of different species of bacteria there. So the immune system has to learn to tolerate all of those organisms and to recognize pathogenic organisms, infections, and exclude them or fight them or kill them. So at the same time that we were developing this complicated microbiota, because invertebrates don't have anything as complicated as that. And when they do have a microbiota, it's isolated from their physiology, whereas our microbiota is actually very close to the wall of the gut. It gets into the mucus layer of the gut, and some of the organisms are even eating the mucus in the gut. You know, it's very close to us. So our immune system had to develop a clever trick in order to be able to learn to tolerate all the organisms in the gut and exclude the pathogens. And what it developed is we call the adaptive immune system. And it's absolutely amazing because, as I was saying, the bacteria can evolve very, very, very fast, but the human evolves very, very slowly. A human generation, 30 years. A bacterium might replicate in 20 minutes. So how do we keep up? Well, the answer is that each baby generates a new immune system. There are mutations. Literally, there is a system creating mutations so that we produce a huge new random selection of lymphocytes and antibodies that can recognize pathogens and so on. And then there's a very complicated process of selecting the ones that are good and that adapt to that recognize something in our real environment, excluding the ones that recognize our own tissues, because those are simply dangerous, excluding and killing off the ones that recognize nothing at all. So that way we develop our repertoire that is fit for the world we are actually born into. But then in the first months of life, this all gets perfected. And it's in the first months of life that all sorts of parameters involved in the regulation of the immune system and the regulation of the metabolic system are set up. So coming back to the point you were making, I'm getting there now. I am answering your question. I'm just taking a long time to do it. Okay, so in those first weeks, they will cut most of it. I know. I know that. I realize they will just take a few phrases, okay. So the shorter answer is that no, it doesn't work the way it does for the divers. The immune system is set up in the first months of life, and if it's not set up right, there is a permanent problem. And there have been beautiful experiments illustrating that, for instance, in mice. I mean, if you give mice penicillin during pregnancy and during the first few weeks of life, you now have mice that are permanent, although their microbiota seems to recover quite quickly when you stop giving the penicillin. They are permanently altered. They will now put on more weight, and they have immune systems that do not function correctly. Because, as I was explaining, the immune system and the metabolic system look at what they see, and they set themselves up to adapt to that particular environment. But it has to, if it's the wrong environment, then you have a physiological problem. It doesn't work like the divers. You end up with a permanent metabolic problem and a permanent immune system problem. No, well, no, of course, it's a problem, because one thing that we know is that the diversity of the microbiota, the number of different species in your microbiota, the number of different sorts of bacteria, seems to be incredibly important. The more diverse it is, the healthier you are. And for instance, people living in the Amazon jungle who have never encountered Westerners, they will have maybe twice or more than twice the diversity of microorganisms in their gut than people living in America. And it's the people with the low diversity of microorganisms who are most susceptible to these forbidden target diseases and persistent inflammation diseases that I was talking about. Um, and and if you simply look at the gut microbiota of people with these disorders and compare them with normal, healthy people, you find that the people with these disorders have much less diverse microbiota. Now, if you eat a very narrow diet, always eating the same thing, and with a very small variety of materials in what you are eating, then similarly, you will have a very narrow repertoire of microorganisms in your gut, because different microorganisms like to digest different things. So you should eat the broadest diversity of foods that you possibly can. And somebody who eats junk food is not eating a broad diversity of food. And above all, a point that I've already made, the fiber, which is found in plant cell walls and therefore in fruit and vegetable, is absolutely essential for certain organisms in the gut, which ferment the fiber to produce molecules which are signaling molecules in your body. They are necessary for the functioning of many physiological systems. So fiber is necessary because it encourages the organisms that you need to have in your gut and that make these molecules which are essential for your physiology. Fiber is found in nice fresh food and vegetables. And there are hundreds of surveys now showing that the healthiest diet is what people call the Mediterranean diet. And by Mediterranean diet we mean something with lots of fruit and vegetables, not too much red meat, and fish and olive oil, and a certain amount of red wine is nice. At least I like interestingly, the red pigment in red wine, which is called resveratrol, is one of the things that seems to encourage diversity of microorganisms in the gut. So you have a good excuse to drink some red wine. Well, I don't know why it is. I mean, it must be an evolutionary thing. After all, the junk food manufacturers put in a lot of fat, they put in a lot of salt, they put in, they put in the things that people like. Um, it's seducing the children to want to eat those things. And after all, let's face it, some vegetables are not really very interesting to eat, are they? But they're good for you. Well, absolutely, yes, because I've been explaining to you how the food that you eat is one of the things that determines the microbiota. And we know, for instance, that certain distortions of the microbiota will encourage development, in particular, of cancer of the colon. And in fact, some other cancers seem to be related, particularly cancers that have been increasing, seem to be related to chronic inflammatory states. And that includes breast cancer and prostate cancer, as well as colon cancer. So, absolutely, if you have the wrong microbiota, then you are more likely to develop cancer. Yes, you have to think of I mean, just as your immune system is farming the microbiota, you have to help it to farm the microbiota. You have to feed your microbiota with the right things, which will encourage the right organisms. And of course, fermented foods, which were always a part of human history, because before we had refrigerators, everything was fermented. It happened automatically. So fermented foods also provide a lot of useful organisms and a diversity of organisms. Look, I would not be a good opinion on that. I mean, whether it's a real addiction, I don't know. I doubt it. I doubt if it's what we would really call an addiction. After all, a real addiction, you you get withdrawal symptoms if you remove it and so on, and you are literally physiologically dependent. I don't think people are addicted to junk food. They just like it. It's that's a very worrying area about which I think we don't know enough yet. But the Center for Disease Control in the United States publishes every few years a report where they have measured levels in blood and urine of American citizens of hundreds of different industrial and agricultural chemicals. And they also measure the metabolites of these industrial and agricultural chemicals. And what one can say is that these chemicals are there in almost everybody. The question is, how harmful is it? Because usually the chemicals are at lower levels than are said to be toxic, but it's very difficult to prove. And there have been studies recently, again in the United States, suggesting that is enough of some of these chemicals, in particular on fruit and vegetables, because it can stick to the surface of the fruit and the surface of the vegetable, to be causing reduced fertility in men and women. So it is potentially very worrying. And we simply don't know yet really how important the effect is. There are also some people who say that statistically there's an increase in certain types of leukemia being caused by exposure to these chemicals. And also some of them have direct endocrine effects. For instance, some of these chemicals mimic estrogen, so they mimic a female hormone. So again, that would certainly be interacting with our endocrine system. So it's all a question of whether there are safe levels, what the safe levels are. It's not so easy to find out. You can imagine it's very difficult to do this kind of epidemiology. Mm. Yeah, well, you could be right. We just I mean, I am not an expert on this, you see. You're really asking the wrong person. Um, but I know that it is extremely worrying. For instance, recently a survey was done in a North African country of table grapes, you know, the sort of grapes that people just eat like fruit on their table, not for making wine. And they measured the levels of chemicals on these grapes. And they were horrified to find that not only was there often levels that were way higher than the permitted level or the level that is thought to be safe, but there were even high levels of chemicals that are not permitted for use in the country in question. I won't tell you which country it was, but so people are still using chemicals that are known to be extremely toxic, but they are still being used by farmers in some countries. And of course, the difficulty is, how do you remove these chemicals? Because washing with, I know this was also something you wanted to ask. Yeah, again, I'm not an expert on this, but clearly washing with water takes off some of these chemicals, but it doesn't take off all of it, and it depends on which chemical it is and which fruit or vegetable it is. Some fruit or vegetables have a kind of waxy coating, like green peppers, for instance, and apples. They can be quite sort of shiny and waxy. And some of these chemicals, which are fat soluble, will actually get into this waxy coating, and you can't get them off by washing. So then the question is, well, as you put in your question, should we be peeling them? Well, I don't know. It depends on whether the levels of these chemicals are high enough to matter. I wish I knew, but I don't. No, I mean, my area of interest is the gut microbiota and in particular what it does to the brain. But no, in any case, that sort of research has to be done by some other organization, not by the company that is making the product, because you can't trust it if it comes from the company that is making the product. And of course, there's more than enough research to say that high levels of sugar are bad for us. And similarly, oh, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Mm, mm. Well, it's conceivable that after, I don't know, a few thousand years, you might adapt to this kind of food. Human evolution is slow. So, no, it is entirely possible that a higher incidence of diabetes and cancer and all of these diseases, as I've said, of forbidden target diseases and persistent inflammation diseases, it's entirely possible that fast food has been responsible in part. It won't be the complete answer, but responsible in part for these increases. And you just have to try to correct your microbiota as much as possible. The problem is that we now know that there's this critical window of time in early childhood when you really do need to have the right microbiota in place. So in your case, you can do some good for yourself by eating a Mediterranean diet with lots of fruit and vegetables now, but you can't completely correct it because many of the organization of your immune system and the organization of your metabolic system and even of your brain, much of that will have occurred in the early years of your life, in the early months even of your life. So I'm sorry to be so depressing.